I'd like to welcome you to the place. This is the place for intellectual, spiritual, and scriptural honesty. This morning, I'm going to talk about the idea of ecclesia. Some people enunciate that ecclesia. There are various pronunciations, that is, of that particular Greek word. It's the Greek word that later was translated, and I shouldn't use the word translate, because this is the abuse that the quote-unquote church gave us. A term was, in a sense, created and actually forced into the pocket, that is, of the semantic domain fields. And it was like it was just molded and crafted just to say, this is the church. Jesus, when he was speaking about the ecclesia, he was not talking about church as we know it today, or even church as those in the earlier centuries were talking about. He was talking about something that was much different. And what I mean is this: if you have someone who says, you have the need, that is, to love, and Jesus certainly made that point. We all have the need for love. It's just something that's, in a sense, hardwired within us. And we all need to belong. In other words, when I get up every morning, there's something about my relationship with my wife that I can't do without. It's not something that I regret. It's something that I have to have. It's something that fulfills me. It's a connection, if you will. And when we gather as two, we become one. And the gathering aspects are extremely important. The less that people gather, they stay foreign to each other. Over the years, I've argued that we need to leave church. I have not argued that we need to quit gathering. But those people who have been listening to me about how church is harmful have, I think, misunderstood some of the things that I've stated. Church is harmful, but when we leave church, we don't need to leave the concept of gathering. One of the things that people in church did wisely is they set up a system of community. In other words, it's superfluous. It's secondary, that is, to what the church is about. It's like, yes, we're here in church and we're hearing all of this doctrine being taught, and yet at the same time, let's have a social club, a social setting. And so churches had people in them that set up a social setting, and this became extremely meaningful and good. But it wasn't the church's design to set that up. The design of the church was to set up something that basically is too synthetic to be good for any form of relationship or kind. I want to travel through this morning slowly, because this is a very sensitive subject. Many people have heard me make statements about the Bible. And they claim, oh, I'm no longer reading the Bible. Paul the Apostle, he addresses this issue this way. Because in the first century, these people were faced with, in a sense, the same kind of problem. They had religion shoved down their throats. They had a particular worldview, that is, a particular faith that was fixed. And so people grew up in the faith. And so when Paul is talking to young Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, he encourages Timothy to go back and look at his esoteric writings, that is, those of Judaism. He was not encouraging young Timothy to say, well, why don't you look at these documents of the past and stay there? He wasn't suggesting that at all. By the time that we get to verse 15, the dynamic of the Greek, the way that Paul is utilizing his terminology, that is in Greek, he's simply saying this: you don't need to look, Timothy, just at these writings that we have been talking about for centuries. You need to look at other writings. And so he states this. He says, Pasa graphe theopneustos. And one of the things that we fail to do sometimes is to wrestle with how terms are used. Many people today are saying theopneustos is actually a Greek word that means God breathed. But let me show you the nonsense of that. It's even in some translation models, unfortunately. If I say that this means God breathed, I'm simply saying I'm taking a compound word. I'm taking the first term in the compound, theos, and then the second word in the compound, pneustos, and I'm saying, wow, let's put these two together and say God breathed. Well, first of all, that's not the way that language works. I can give you an example. Let's talk about a butterfly for a moment. And let's look at the two words, butter and fly. Go to any dictionary and look up the term butter, look up the word fly, and then put those two terms together and find out if a butterfly has anything at all to do with butter. And I think you're seeing my point. It would be a failure to render the compound word with the idea of butter in mind. And so, likewise, the same is true with Paul's usage with this particular compound word. It's a failure, not a small failure, but a huge failure, to render theopneustos as a compound, that is, a God-breathed idea. It's not a concept of God breathing, because that would defeat, number one, the logic of the Apostle Paul. He's not trying to impose on Timothy by saying everything that you're reading is technically directly from God's voice, or he breathed it, or yada, yada, yada. You can go in a literal, or you can use it allegorically. He's not doing that. What Paul is attempting to do is to get people to realize he's trying to get young Timothy to not be so nervous. He's a very tense young man. He even encourages this young man to drink a little wine. Settle down. I want you to look at something. I want you to focus for a minute. Go back and read all of the writings that you grew up with. And in contrast or juxtaposition, I want you to analyze them as opposed to all of the other writings. And by the way, all writings, not just the ones that you grew up with, everyone who writes is inspired. It's an amazing inspiration. And so what we do is we see that sometimes when compounds are used like this, it's just to be emphatic. In other words, to emphasize. In other words, these writings, all of the writings are emphatically speaking inspired. And so this is what you do when you deal with Greek. You add preformatives. You put things together with preformatives. You also put things in compounds to do this. This is the way that language works. But so many people are trying to argue that Paul is trying to tell young Timothy to look at all Scripture that he grew up with, and that all Scripture is actually inspired by God himself, yada, yada, yada. And that's simply not what Paul is suggesting. I guess my point is, those of you who have heard me teach over the years about leaving church and my critical nature of the Bible, and please understand the Bible is not just one book and it depends on which canon that you're using, but let's pick on the Protestant canon. It has 66 books in it. I contend that each and every one of these books has various authors in them. It's a complex conundrum in a sense. And so the canon makers gave us many problems by squashing, if you will, all these premises and conclusions all together, trying to not render the intent of each author as each author would have you understand their writings. But this is basically trying to harmonize, in a sense of trying to unify all of these people throughout hundreds of years of history. And we know that that just doesn't happen. And we don't need to make a magic book out of the Bible. And when you canonize it and you start thinking that all of this has unity and it has harmony, you have turned it into magic, something that it isn't. And this is where I really have a bone to pick, in a sense. I have a dog in this fight when people start speaking about the writings, that is, of the Bible. I find that both theists and, please hear this, atheists, for the most part, are illiterate when it comes to an understanding of these writings. Now, the reason that I make that statement, it's because several things concern me. When theists hear me teach, they hear me criticizing this book that has many books in it. And some people would say, well, I'm just going to take my Bible and put it on the shelf. That's not good. Because if I started analyzing, for instance, your favorite song, and I started being as critical with your favorite song as I am about these writers of the Bible, you would probably put those favorite songs of yours, you would probably put them on the shelf also. So you need to understand the process of what we are doing when we criticize something. We're not trying to damage. In other words, my wife and I, we criticize each other all the time. It's not to damage each other, but it's to bring a sense of honesty in our relationship. And in doing so, what we're doing is growing each other up, trying to realize how we really connect. That is, taking all pretension out of the way. So the question is, if you have a book, or if you have a book of writings that come from the ancient world, and if these writings suggest to you that they have things like this, the Apostle Paul talks about moving from faith to faith, that is, being in transition. In other words, he's simply saying we can't get stuck in belief. We need to keep moving forward. Today we may think this, but maybe tomorrow we may think differently. Our perception today is just so small. Don't get trapped in that. Don't, Timothy, young Timothy, I know you're nervous. You grew up with sacred writings, and look at them, but objectively look at the rest of the writings. When Paul went to Mars Hill, he did not debate these people with his quote-unquote Jewish canon. He debated those people from the standpoint of the poets. And if you'll look at the evidence, that is, of how the canons were actually put together, they were put together based upon the premise of what these particular apostles were saying and suggesting, and whatever they said was gospel or from God. And so the question is, why did we leave out the poets? And no one wants to deal with that because the poets demonstrate something that's diametrically opposed to a lot of the writings in the so-called Bible. And that's the reason that you don't have many of the other writings of the other apostles. It's because this just really challenged people to think. In other words, if you have people that are so obviously not on the same page, you don't want to combine that. You want to create, in a sense, a mask. And this is what the church gave us. This is why I'm so against the church, the term church. If you apply that to the Bible, that is the ancient manuscripts, that's an illiterate move. In other words, there's no way to look at Greek or Hebrew and suggest that you have, as I state often, a syntagmatic and paradigmatic analysis that would suggest remotely that church would fit. What does fit is something so simple. It simply means to gather. That's its basic meaning. In other words, semantically we have meaning, and then we have the pragmatic side, how it's used. And so someone today can use the Greek word ekklesia to mean church. I agree with that, but none of the writers of the first century ever used the term ekklesia to mean church in any sense. And so to make the point clear, if you want to continue to use the term church, know you are doing so. You're doing it in opposition to what Jesus and the rest of the writers actually said and or wrote. And hopefully you can see my point. And so to suggest that Jesus said church is wrong. It's not just wrong, but if you read it and you say that it's there, you're lying to yourself. It's just not there. And so church people need to say, wow, this is something that I really need to think through. Do I need to use the word church? If so, what is my justification for doing so? I keep wanting people to leave the church, but to go where? You need to go away from, leave places that are not honest. And you need to go to places that encourage community. Without community, we have no bridges. We have no roads. It takes people gathering together, building concepts, building a sense of responsibility to have bridges and highways. Today, one fourth of all of our bridges are in jeopardy of falling down. The latest statistics given by many reporters has been that these bridges are over 50 years old and are built upon the specs that no one would build any bridge today. Reporters have even gone so far as to say we need to put warning signs in front of 1/4, that is 25% of our bridges here in the United States of America, to warn people these bridges may collapse if you drive over them. Those are not my words, but the words of those who have done their research. My point is, responsible people get together, and they're not just concerned about Isaiah or the Apostle Paul. They're concerned about our children and where they might travel, that is, on a highway somewhere. Responsible people gather together to build hospitals, universities. They build different environments to help the elderly, the homeless. If you want to be responsible, you need to learn that community is how all of this stuff starts. It's when people start gathering for the purpose of doing various wonderful things. So I'm trying to encourage people to leave church, not to stay by yourself. You need to learn how to say, I don't need to live the rest of my life without Japanese people, without Chinese people, without the Italians. I need to be all-inclusive. I need to get to know all human beings all the way around this world. I need to understand what they understand. and they need to understand what I perceive to be true, and we need to come to some kind of conclusion that would be reasonable, that is, together. My point is, this is exactly what Jesus was teaching. The message that he taught about going into all of the world was not to save the world, but it was to get people to have connection with people in other parts of the world. For instance, he came to the Jews, and the Jews, they didn't accept him. He was trying to tell the Jews, if you stay here in Jerusalem, you're going to die. You need to get out of Dodge, if you will. You need to leave this place. Unfortunately, most of them didn't and died. And so Jesus certainly understood some things that were meaningful, not just about leaving concepts of danger, that is, the destruction of Jerusalem, but he also indicated that this is the manner in which you need to learn how to behave. Think about what he taught. No one greater. I'm talking about back in that day, there was no one greater teaching a greater message of love than Christ. What was the purpose of Christ? To teach us how to love, to get the ball rolling, to teach us that we don't need to be warring with our enemies. We need to love our enemies. We need to embrace our enemies. We need to forgive our enemies. Whatever we have against them, we need to get rid of that. That is wonderful therapy. I mean, in a sense, he was a psychologist to those people. He was trying to get them to get rid of their issues. And so when I hear people say, I have faith in science, and the reason I'm picking on that, if I made that statement, that is, if I lived 200 years ago, I love science. Whatever textbook I was using 200 years ago would be on the shelf with lots of dust. And today, the textbooks that we're using in science, 200 years from now, those same textbooks will be on the shelf with dust. Now, here's my point. If we take the Bible, and if we take all of these people who are not speaking about the same premises, they're not coming to the same conclusions, but one of the things that they're doing, they are struggling, they are wrestling with who they are. And I ask this question: who isn't wrestling with who they are? Who isn't trying to figure out how do we connect with each other successfully? We can argue, science is the only thing for me. Well, science is but a dot on the wall. In your life, what you experience on a daily basis, day in and day out, 24/7, 365 days out of every year, you're going to find that it's not all about science. It's not all about empirical evidence. Much of your life is heavily involved in just these subjective experiences that you just have to deal with. And you need something that will help you to deal with the subjective world, these subjective experiences. And for someone to come along and say, just trash your Bible. You don't need to understand the past and how they struggled with their own sense of humanity, doesn't really make sense. For history is good. If we learn from their mistakes, we will not fill in the blank. If we learn from their mistakes, we have the potential of not making the same mistakes. If we can find motivation from those ancients, it might encourage us to move further down the road. But sometimes what we create is we create these models of looping, circling in a sense. We're just going around and around, and it reminds me of what the children of Israel did for 40 years. We just go around and around and around, and we follow the fashions of life rather than trying to be sensible and logical with all of these manuscripts and all of this evidence throughout history, whether it's linguistically speaking or in another discipline. You know, it's true that Albert Einstein did a marvelous work, but we don't need to forget what he labored so hard to give us, but we have moved past that. And yet we need to see his heart and why and what motivated him to move transitionally from one point to the next. And so my point is, my concern is, why are so many people trashing theology in the name of science? For theology 2,000 years ago wasn't so much God talk, but it was about the journey. It was about the process of learning. It was about the process of saying, how do I deal with this subjective experience and that one? How do I deal rationally with different kinds of people, different ethnic groups? Do I need to say, oh, I don't need to hear that. I want only the empirical evidence going into my ears. You're going to be so small if you do that. Only a small-minded person would think, oh, I just need to deal with the empirical evidence. No, there are rational arguments that you need to deal with, and then there are other things that just come your way that just require common sense, and you really don't even know what you're doing sometimes. You're just floundering, if you will. And sometimes just picking up a book, whether it's fictional or not, sometimes it just gives you a sense of hope just to get up in the morning. We can complain about theology and say we don't have any need for it. And I'm claiming that we even have a need for mythology. Mythological writers were not writing just to confuse people. They were writing things that would help people to move forward. The same thing can be stated concerning Star Trek. These people had no idea as to how it would impact millions of people. They stimulated people in a better direction. In a sense, it was fictional. In another sense, it was a dream. It was just trying to reach out and grasp what they couldn't grasp right now. But they were like artists, if you will, simply trying to look beyond and just conceive of something better. I like Dr. Martin Luther King. He stimulated us to dream. What's wrong with dreaming? You know, what empirical evidence do you have in most of our dreams? I mean, you're just dreaming. You're producing concepts, and you're trying to get there, and you will find something within yourself, a means, a vehicle to get there. But there's something powerful about that dream or that sense of hope that you yourself can create. And back in the first century, just the willingness to say, I'm dreaming. They would say, this is God. It was just saying, oh, I have the willingness just to hope. I'm going to say that this is God. Just the willingness to say, let's get beyond all of this depression, this condemnation. We will just say, this is God. So why do we gather? Why do we get together and enjoy one another? Why do we sometimes come together and argue and fight and find reasons to divide? You see, we need to learn that in time, if we can learn from each other, and we can move forward together. Now, I'm rabbit trailing a lot intentionally, but some people have major psychological issues, and they will find every reason in the world not to come together. They're looking for every excuse in the world to be recluse because they don't want to face getting well. They are addicted to being, in a sense, sick. That's speaking to some of you. You don't want to come together. You don't want to be motivated to come together. And please understand, every time that you come together, we have many gathering places for the New Covenant group. And sometimes some of you guys that gather together with us, you're not all inspired. That's fine. You need to understand that coming together isn't always a delightful thing, but a necessary thing. Because there is a time for something comfortable, and there is a time for something that's called the testing periods of what we go through when we're going through challenges. I love my wife. She loves me. We operate as one, but on a daily basis, there are struggles. And there is a commitment to the struggle. There's a commitment to the wrestling match of having a wonderful and a magnificent relationship. And if humanity is going to operate as one and quit having these wars that kill each other, we are going to have to find reasons that are beyond our capabilities, that is, in the scientific world, that can deal with these things. Now, as a linguist, I'm claiming that linguistic science has a lot to put on the table. Most of the time when I talk with people who reject the writings of the Bible, I'm talking with people who don't even know what they're talking about. Last week I heard a person make the statement, a comparison of Jesus with a sword, comparing that to, I think it was Samuel. Jesus said that he came not to bring peace. Why did he make that statement? I didn't come to bring peace. This will make people in the scientific community feel wonderful about what they do if they understand what Jesus was doing. He's simply coming and saying, hey, I came to separate I came to separate the fathers from the sons and the mothers from the daughters. What is he doing? Trying to separate families? No, he's simply saying, I want younger people to get outside of the box, that is, that box that their parents are trapped in. And I'm going to use a metaphorical sword in order to get the younger generation to move forward. And see, the scientific community is applauding that kind of mindset today. Don't think like your parents. Go to a university and learn something that's much better than what they learned. Keep moving forward. So in a sense, our universities are patterned after the rhetoric and the mindset and intent of Jesus that is in that story. But most people are what? Literalist. They look at Jesus. Oh, you're coming along doing something mean-spirited. No, he wasn't. He was attempting to bring people to a rational side of life. He never made the claim, I did everything, I finished the work, and I've done everything A to Z, I'm the Savior of the world. He never made those claims. However, men did. And so I think that we've painted false pictures of Jesus Christ. Now, I'm like this. I love Jesus and I love Darwin. And I think that we who love evolution, I think that we've painted a false picture of Darwin. I don't think that Darwin knew as much as a lot of us give him credit for, but sometimes we do that in the name of making him into an icon. And the same thing is true with believers in Jesus. Sometimes we use hyperbole to market Jesus. You can't say that evolution isn't being marketed without lots of hyperbole. It is. Have you ever heard someone who advocates evolution really get into a discussion with someone who is a creationist? I mean, in a sense, they're really not talking about apples and apples, because evolution until here recently. Now, you do have some people who are articulating something about evolution now that may deal with the possibility of origin, but most of the time when we're talking about evolution and the origin of it all, those are two different things. In other words, the thing that people are accepting today as good science isn't about our origin. That's still up in the air. It's much guesswork. And so my point is, if we can come to the table of a discussion and say, let's be logical about this. Let's talk about evolution, but let's not just talk about evolution, but let's talk about our beginnings. That is, if there actually was a beginning. Now, I'm not so much of a creationist. When people hear me state that, they're quite alarmed, and it's because the term creation, number one, is overused. It's like the term God is overused. And when you have overused terms, people just go crazy with them. And so I will get more specific about God and creation and what I perceive to be true in another teaching. But my point this morning is simple. As the Apostle Paul encouraged young Timothy, the one who was so nervous, don't look at just the ancient writings of your heritage, but think outside of the box. Look at all the other writings. Now, is that a compliment to the scientific community today? Yes, it is. But ask the scientific community today, are you willing to look not just at your current documents, but are you willing to look back into the past and admit to the authenticness of what these people were attempting to do? And so if we can do that, if we can gather people together and explore not just our current day, but our past days, we might be able to deal more reasonably with the future. And by the way, we can't do this just as one person. It has to be a conversation. In other words, every Sunday when some of you guys are getting together in different studios, like the studio we have in East Texas, there should be an agenda in a sense. Let's get together and have chicken. Chicken or, a New York cut. That would be nice. Let's have steaks. Let's have barbecue. Whatever. Let's get together and have some fellowship. Let's start the conversation going. Let's learn how to like each other. Because you can't communicate with people you don't like. Linguistically, that's impossible. Language is something that is extremely imperfect. And if you can't like someone, your willingness to communicate just isn't there. Therefore, whatever kind of linguistic acquisition that you do put forth, it's going to be more or less failed. And this is why Jesus was attempting to get people to like one another, love one another, because in loving one another, we can have meaningful communication, the ability to get to know one another. I don't know about you, but it would be wonderful if we could connect all nations, all races of people, and become one. Just one. I'm talking about a world in which we can come together and learn how to love and nurture and take care of one another. Now, you can back up for a moment and say, is that going on? Not really. Because we have church and things like church. Church is about division. It says, if you're getting my points, in the words of Joey, if you're getting my point, then you can stay around. If you're not, leave. In other words, if you accept my doctrines, you're a part of it. If you won't accept my doctrines, you're not a part of it. Jesus didn't state anything like that. He was attempting to say, listen, We're going down the road right now. The disciples jump up and say, hey, those people are saying something quite different than we are. And Jesus said, leave them alone. They're fine. They're going in the same direction. They're moving forward with us. This is why Jesus attempted to teach hard-headed, maybe hard-shelled Jews something by stating, why don't you become like a child? See, children can accept people willingly. It just, unconditionally. They just accept people. They can just look at someone and say, I want to play. Let's get the toys out. Let's have fun. You don't have to have lots of money spent. We can play with just, there's water, there's dirt. We can create mud. We can have fun. It's that simple. The willingness to have a sense of community, the willingness to like each other. Liking each other creates what? Loving each other creates what? It creates a conversation. And so if you look around and you don't see very many people, it means that the people that you're looking at are not doing, well, let me not say it that way. It may mean that the people around you are not doing a very good job at liking and loving other people. Or it may mean that other people are not willing to even get in the conversation because of a certain bias. So I hope this is encouraging you to take a step. We do need the writings that are in the Bible. We do need to read them. We do need to wrestle with their journeys, even though they are, in many cases, maniacal. These people were authentically saying, this is what I perceive to be true. I think that God is an earthquake, or he's sending she-bears after children. That's what someone thought was true. Let's not run away from those who were sick, are sick, and may be sick. Let's learn how to deal with everyone and realize that they are just as important as you. Thank you for your time.